Hi, welcome back to Rabbit Hole History, where each week for 6 weeks I dive into a historical topic that I'm interested in. My name is Shannon, and this week is week number 4 in my 6-week dive into ancient Greek history. If you tuned in last week, I spoke about buildings and architecture in ancient Greece, particularly surrounding the 3 different Ionic, Doric, and Corinthian columns. If you haven't checked out that video, and the ones before that, I've made 3 more so far, be sure to go back and check those out if you're interested. But this week we're going to be taking a look at what I think is a good segue from buildings and architecture, entertainment. There's still a lot of Greek entertainment and influences from Greek entertainment that we still either study or literally still participate in today. So I figured for episode 4, I'll take a look at what that entails. So let's just jump right back into it. Welcome back to Rabbit Hole History. Okay, so I think the biggest, most well-known piece of Greek entertainment is obviously the Olympics, but I don't want to talk about that first. I was a theater kid in middle school and high school. It was the extracurricular that I loved doing the most, and so I want to start with Greek tragedies and dramas.
The theater.
The theater in Greek history began from a religious standpoint when they would perform tragedies at religious festivals in Athens. If you recall from my very first video on this channel, which if you haven't seen, feel free to go check out, Athens was kind of the epicenter during this flourishing of Greek history where a lot of cultural touchstones took place. The first plays came in the form of tragedies, and thus in turn inspired the exact opposite, comedies. There's also a third type of Greek play that we recognize called satire plays. Satire plays, just as a little side note, were performed in between the acts of the tragedies and made fun of things. It was pretty satirical. The origins of a Greek tragedy are kind of debated amongst historians and scholars today. Some say it arose from the lyrical performance of epic poetries. Others feel that there's a link to Greek tragedies with the way that ancient Greeks celebrated and worshipped the god Dionysus. This ritual included performing songs known as tragodias and wearing masks, which is very similar to the theater in ancient Greece. Either way, Dionysus became known as the god of theater, and the Greek tragedy eventually became a modern and sought-after form of entertainment. These plays were performed in an open-air theater. The actors on stage were all male, and it's even contested and debated whether or not women were even allowed to sit in the audience. Which is goofy, but anyway, the plays themselves were almost exclusively inspired by Greek mythology, which for the time it was pretty serious subject matter because the mythology was their religion. And a lot of times these stories were literally tragedies. There was no winning and it was pretty dark material. Because of this, there was no violence permitted on stage and any deaths had to be committed off stage. You had to either just hear or it was implied that a character died. In the beginning, these tragedies were only performed by one person. That's where we get the masks. The actors would wear a mask and a costume, and they would be able to play so many different characters. Because of this kind of one-man show, that's where a lot of historians still pull that connection to maybe the tragedy arose from a religious ceremony because it is similar to a priest reciting a myth or a sermon of sorts. But as time went on, more actors were added to the stage, and that one lead actor would end up performing and reciting this play to a chorus of up to 15 different actors. But the chorus wouldn't speak, they would only dance and sing, which is pretty close to my middle and high school theater experience. The lead actor could also change costumes behind the stage, and that would allow them to break a play up into different segments or acts. Eventually, this allowed for musical interludes, and the whole production process itself became more grandiose and celebrated, with the use of masks, costumes, and gestures becoming extremely important elements to a performance. The rules in a tragedy are pretty strict, especially in this time period. and especially when you compare it to the rules and structure of the other flip side of the coin to Greek drama, the Greek comedy. Now, the comedy is obviously a lot funnier, a lot looser, a lot more probably representative of what people were really like during this time period. They actually used humor and sexual jokes and satire in these scripts and performances. These performances were also much more theatrical and outlandish and followed a certain structure as well. The first act of a comedy is the parados, where a chorus of up to 24 actors and performers enter the stage and perform a whole bunch of songs and dances, all while dressed very outrageously. So outrageous, in fact, that oftentimes the play itself would be named after the first act. My source from worldhistory.org tells me that one famous example of a play that was actually named after the chorus is Aristophanes' The Wasps. The second piece of the show was called an agon, or agon, and included verbal sparring and debate with fast-moving plot elements and rapidly changing scenes. This act might have also included some improv, like an ancient upright citizens brigade. There was a third act called the Parabasis, where the chorus kind of did a fourth wall break and spoke to the audience, often on behalf of the poet or author of the play. And the finale was called the Exodus and ended the same way that the play began, with a huge song and dance routine from the chorus. It kind of just sounds like a musical at this point, but I think that's a testament to theater as we know it today. This is truly the origin of everything that we follow in the structure of theater, musicals, plays, comedies, tragedies, movies, TV shows, everything that we know about entertainment today. So let's move on to our next piece of Greek entertainment, the Olympics. Similar in origin to ancient Greek theater, the ancient Olympic Games were primarily a part of a religious festival in ancient Greece honoring Zeus. Athletes would flock in from all over the Greek world to participate in these games and religious ceremony. The first Olympic Games was a foot race and began in 776 BC. The race itself was only about 600 feet long. And for about 200 years, the games took place at the sanctuary of Olympia itself. Eventually, they built more stadium-like structures to attract more attendees. And because of these more modern, sleeker builds, or at least modern and sleek to their standards, audience attendance actually grew by 50%. And they had these ancient Olympic Games for about 1,000 years. Since the games attracted so many people, it kind of turned into a giant festival and craft fair of sorts. While the games went on, there would be a lot of artists, painters, and people that would just put their wares on display for sale. It was great marketing and opportunity to sell your stuff. But because the origin of these games was inherently religious, by the time the Roman Empire took over, the games were kind of done away with and officially banned in 393 AD to promote Christianity. This quote from a historian at Brown University says, "He deemed the games equivalent to paganism and had them done away with." And so while I'm really only going to talk about it up until that point in its ancient lifetime, I guess, the modern-day Olympics were revived in 1896 by a man named Baron Pierre de Coubertin. To honor the legacy, the first modern Olympics was held in Athens, with 34 countries originally participating. I think this is just another interesting origin to modern-day entertainment. I mean, it stopped for literally 1,503 years, but it was still revived, and even 100 years later, it's still one of the most world-renowned, respected, anticipated event of modern entertainment. So with that kind of covered, I wanted to leave this video off with one more bit of Greek entertainment that I thought would be interesting to take a look at. What did the fashion look like in ancient Greece? Now, a lot of what was documented in Greek fashion was more prone to higher upper class people. But I think unfortunately the same can be said for a lot of historical periods when it comes to fashion and accessibility like that. It was expensive, and most people couldn't afford to dress very lavishly or afford the clothing that is more preserved or documented. But I was able to find kind of what your everyday person walking down the street would be wearing, and that consists of two garments. An undergarment, known as a chiton or peplos, and a cloak, known as a himation or a chlamys. Please forgive my pronunciation. Not only do I not understand ancient Greek language or even modern-day Greek language, but I'm sick again, and my nose is stuffed again. But anyway, your everyday Greek fashion was more all about functionality rather than fashion or ornamentation. And unfortunately, no clothes have actually survived from this time period. So we're left to sculpture and artwork to kind of make our assessments on what people wore. The clothes of this time period also had a double purpose. People would use them for other purposes such as bedding. Since it was most often homemade or at least locally made, the clothes were very simply colored, most often white or neutral colored, and it really only got more ornamental or used different kinds of colors in the upper class. What's probably most noted in these recounts and artistic depictions of what the clothing looked like was the appreciation for the human body. It's said, and you can especially see it in sculptures, that the fabric was, quote, expertly draped around the body, and the cloth would be slightly transparent. And I think that's really interesting because you do see that showing in a lot of sculpture and marble work from the time period. A lot of their clothes just don't even really seem to be clothing them or covering them up. In terms of accessories, ornamentation in the form of jewelry was very common, and almost more of an expression of fashion than clothing was. Using primarily gold, Greeks wore a lot of different jewelry, from rings to earrings to necklaces. A lot of it is said to be passed down from generation to generation, much like today, and the design of the jewelry often represented the gods and goddesses. Now, unlike the other two topics I touched on today, I don't think a lot of ancient Greek fashion and jewelry shows up in today's trends, but I still think it's interesting. It was still a form of expression and a way to entertain yourself. It's also not something I think was really covered when I was learning about ancient Greece originally, so I figured I'd just take a look. And that's where I'm gonna end the rabbit hole dive for this week. I really liked this episode. This was really fun to take a look back on. I mean, obviously it was entertaining, literally. And I hope it was entertaining for you to kind of learn about stuff like this. So anyway, thank you very much for watching. If you've made it this far, I really appreciate it. Let me know what you thought in the comments down below. If you learned anything from this video or got anything out of it, have you ever seen a performance of a Greek tragedy or comedy? Or have you been to the Olympics, whether it's the summer or winter? Or maybe you've traveled to Greece and have seen what is left of the stadiums. Either way, let me know, and I'd be really interested in hearing what you have to say. Next week is probably going to be my favorite week of the 6-week rabbit hole dive here. We're going to be in the kitchen, and I've already ordered a weird ingredient for the recipe. Let's just hope I stop being sick and my nose unplugs before then. So until then, thank you again so much for watching, and we'll see you next week.